So Max Lucado is a preacher, teacher, communicator, writer, all those things that you heard in the introduction. Uh, but gosh, I mean, what a storyteller Max Lucado is. And so, but I'm going to get to that. First, I want to just say too, when you approach the task of teaching and preaching, in particular preaching, where does the process begin for you? Because you're preaching on a regular basis. Where does it begin for you as you begin to think towards that Sunday message? How far away? That kind of stuff.
Mm. Well, by the way, thank you so much, Ed. I'm really, really grateful for the chance to talk about this topic. I love the whole world of the whole pulpit world. You know, all the preaching, the teaching, the study, everything involved with it, and thoroughly appreciate the opportunity to swap ideas with some folks, and maybe to be an encouragement, because it could be hard work.
It is.
So I am into a pretty good rhythm, and probably for like the last 15 years, have been in a rhythm where I'm able to uh, land on a sermon series, which is a challenge sometimes in and of itself. But I'm able to land on that sermon series about 4 or 5 months in advance of when I begin preaching it. And because about 15 years ago, there was a sabbatical I was able to take and get ahead. I've been able to kind of maintain that and stay ahead of the game. And so consequently, I have about half of the sermons prepared for, let's just say, a 12 or 13-week sermon series before I begin the sermon series. And I've come to learn that's pretty unique. Forever I was finishing my sermon on Saturday morning for the Saturday night service, and when I was able to create that space is when I found like that I could really uh, enjoy the process more, Ed, and and that extra time of the sermon being finished and not needing to be preached for about 6 weeks. It's extraordinary, the difference, because
Mm.
it can marinate. I have experiences in life that I'll go back and thumbtack to that sermon that I wouldn't have had otherwise. I come across some insights, maybe some scriptures that I thought, oh wow, that fits in that message. And so right now I'm in that type of rhythm where I'm able to identify the sermon series and then prepare about half of the lessons before I begin preaching them. And that's really a game changer for me.
So how much of it is done how far ahead? I mean, it sounds like a lot more than you used to. It's certainly a lot more than I'm used to.
Yeah.
So, but give us a little more detail. How much, how far?
Uh, I would say at least 50% of the sermons are complete. And when I say complete, a complete manuscript, all of my sermons are candidates for books. I've been
Right, right.
accused of having no unpublished thought, and that's probably true.
Yeah.
Because and knowing that ultimately or eventually this particular sermon will need to be a chapter in a book, then I just go ahead and type the whole thing out. When I first began preaching back in the early 80s, I was an outline guy. I just had notes scribbled on an index card, and but now I, I I type up, 2,800, 3,000 words, 3,200 words, knowing it's going to ultimately be a chapter in a book. I might as well go ahead and get it in good
Mm.
shape. And so that is finished. Like, for example, just this morning, I worked on lesson number 8 in a series on the life of Elijah that I will begin the sermon series, Ed, in 3 weeks. So
Wow.
I'm again, I know this is really rare, but
No, no, it's unheard of. It's not really
it's
rare. It's
unheard
unheard
of.
of. I've
Yeah,
never heard. I mean, everyone else is talking about what they're doing Wednesday and
I know,
Friday.
I know. And I get that. And that was me forever. And I
Yeah.
guess that the reason that when you asked me about, I kind of read into or I took advantage of your question to say, I would suggest the one thing that has helped me more
Yeah.
than anything else in all these years of preaching is to get a huge head start
Okay.
on a sermon series, and whatever I just had a conversation with a guy the other day who was asking, is it worth it for him to approach his church leadership and request a study break, because he feels like he's just, cramming for exams every Saturday night. And I said, by all means, do whatever it takes. If you can get a 6-week study break to give you some, breathing room, so that you can truly just live with that scripture, or live with that story, or live with that Bible character for several weeks in advance. That to me was the game changer. It first happened to me in a book called, it eventually became a book called Facing Your Giants, and it was a study of the life of David. And this was I remember it sometime around 9/11, Ed, that I had a study break, and I used it to get way ahead on that sermon series. And I was stunned how more relaxed I was.
Hmm.
Come Wednesday or Thursday before the weekend message, I had to go back and review it because it was so long ago that I'd prepared it. But boy, that spit and polish on Thursday and Friday was a delight. And I would go into the service on Sunday really feeling like I'd prayed over the message and prepared for the message. It's worth it, I believe.
Yeah, it's fascinating because I would tell you I don't do that. I don't have the discipline to do that. But because so sometimes I'll preach a sermon. I'm 2 or 3 weeks out, and I'm 2 or 3 weeks of thinking of illustrations or things of that sort. And then 3 weeks after I preach a sermon, I would see would have been a great illustration for that. And if I had just prepared that 5 weeks earlier, I would have been able to include that in. So I can see why it just opens up a wide array of new things to say. Oh, this would fit. So when I'm assuming you're working on computer. Do you have like these files and you can go back to, oh, I can add something to that and I'm going to do that in 6 weeks and I can drop that in? How do you update as you go?
Yeah. Great question. Great question. I write everything out longhand. I use, if you'll allow me just to reach over and grab one of these. This is those people who are participating in our message, viewing it. I use a flip tablet, and I write it out longhand,
Right.
double spaced, and I know after all these years how many of those pages will translate into, I get a 30-minute message, and how many pages I can write. It's about 22 of those, and that'll turn into a 30-minute message. And I hand that to my wonderful assistant who has learned to decipher my horrible handwriting. And she will enter that into the computer. And then from then on, I'm working from computer. And then when I have ideas, I'll go back to the computer and I'll add that story or add that scripture, but it's right there in the computer. And I organize it under a file like Elijah. There's a file that says Elijah, and then I number them. And I have pretty good recall as to what the key point is in each of those messages. And so if I come across a story, I can take that story and I can insert it into that sermon, and it seems to work. And can I just quickly add, I
Please.
realize what I just said is a bit of a luxury to many pastors. Okay. When I came to the church where I've served these many years, we were about a 300 or 400 member church, and I was the third person hired. I was there was a staff of 2 people, and then they hired me as a senior pastor, and then one of the 2 left. And so I didn't have a good track record. And I remember, and I know very well what it's like to lead a medium-sized, mid-sized congregation or
Yeah.
smaller church. It's very time intensive and demanding. So maybe what I'm describing is a bit of a luxury, because once we had a larger staff, more staff people, I was able to have a little more elbow room. I had an
Right.
executive pastor, I had a better team. So I get that. I acknowledge that this could be a luxury that happens as the team grows. I do think it's worth pursuing if at all possible.
Yeah, but you could do the level of pre-planning. It's not like you're adding more work. It's more like you're backing up the timing on the work.
Yes, sir.
So
And
that
and in
that seems doable.
my conversation with the young pastor about a study break, I said, well, let's just brainstorm. Do you have it? Could it be maybe during a summer, or could it be Could it be guest speakers from around town? I said, you can count on me for one or two of those, or maybe there's a retired pastor who would like to come in and needs, to be honest, a little honorarium and can work for 6 weeks. So there's ways to create a gap of study that I think make it doable for people of any size church.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you're right. Probably the study leave may be a little bit harder to do, but partly what we're even with this series, this Great Communicator series, we are recognizing that people are in different experiences, but we're gleaning so much from the conversation about best practices, and this is super helpful. Your longevity of preparation is fascinating to me. So, talk to me how many hours, I should say, not necessarily because they're spread out, but how many hours a week are you in study? I actually know that we're recording this during your study, so I know you sometimes break your rule. I won't tell anybody.
I'll do
But
anything for Ed Stetzer. I'll do
thank you, brother.
anything.
But how many hours a week does Max Lucado spend working on sermons?
All day Monday is blocked for sermons. All day Tuesday is blocked for anything, hodgepodge. If somebody comes up to me after church and says, could I get 10 minutes with you? I say, okay, next Tuesday. And we just squeeze them in. I mean,
Right.
it's like a run, Tuesday is my day. I mentally say, okay, I'm just here to do whatever needs to be done. Wednesday, I come back with another half day of study. And then Thursday is a full day of study. I really try to take Fridays off, but we all know I'm as guilty as others. If I've not done the work I need to get done, I'll use a Friday to do it. But I would say Monday, half day Wednesday, full day Thursday, so 2.5 days. And if I can get a good 2.5 days, I think I can prepare a message, that's pulpit worthy by God's grace for Sunday.
2.5 days, so 16, 20 hours. And we're hearing a lot of numbers around 10 to 15 to 20. I think yours might be on the higher end. And I think I wonder if a part of it has to do with the way you're preparing. I mean, you're in way, when I was younger, it was Chuck Swindoll would preach the sermon's book. And now it's Max Lucado, preach the sermon's book. And and I love that. We love talking to you about him because you've been a gift to the church, but that probably, I'm guessing, impacts some of your preparation.
I think you're spot on there, Ed. I think knowing that this is eventually going to be presented to the publisher as an idea or a manuscript, or it's going to go to my editor, I think I just say, I'm going to put in the extra hours now and get it done.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk some about the structure of that preparation. So now we've talked some about the longevity. What does it look like, a Max Lucado message, when you're standing up there with your notes? How are the points laid out? How do you get to those points? How do you flesh out those points? Just walk us through what you do every week and help us get a picture of that.
Thank you for that question. That's a really good one. I like to get a big idea for the sermon series, a theme that is a recurring theme. For example, with Elijah, and I use that as an example because it's on my mind. I landed on the theme steadfast. I've always loved that word, steadfast. It's just a good old English word, steadfast. And I believe of the many things Elijah teaches us, he teaches us how to remain steadfast when you're outnumbered. And in our world today, oh my goodness, do we not feel outnumbered? And so there's a lot of great parallels. So once I landed on that, and I will say that took, 3 or 4 days of reading through the story of Elijah, getting reacquainted and so forth. Then I go back and begin working out each message. But my goal, Ed, and this is, I think, helpful. If the theme is a steadfast faith, then what does the story of Mount Carmel teach us about Elijah's steadfast faith? What does his retreat into the cave under in the Sinai desert, when he's despondent and wanting to give up. What does that say to Lucado, or what does that say to our church about how to have a steadfast faith? So I try to be pretty stubborn with that question. What does each one of these incidents have to do with creating steadfast faith? So I've even gone so far as to take a question like that and write it out and stick it on my computer screen, so I'm reminded not to chase rabbits. And I want to bring every message back to bear to answer that one question.
Okay,
And
so
I
let
try
me
to,
ask you, so make sure I understand. So when you're saying like the steadfast faith, that's the theme of the entire series, then
yes,
each
sir.
individual message. Okay, I got you.
Yes,
All
sir.
right.
I'm sorry if I wasn't clear.
No, I
Yeah,
was what I didn't track it, but that makes sense to me. So
yeah.
that's the overarching series theme, and
Uh-huh.
then you start sewing it into the individuals.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Now, I love character studies, and so I think that's a great way to tackle some of these topics. One of the challenges of a character study is that it's hard to find sometimes what is the central theme, because so many different things happen. But if you can find one, I think that really helps. And so then I just dig in, and uh, I I like other pastors, I have a pretty good library, and I'll create a book of just about everything that's been written in English on the story of Elijah. Commentaries. You mentioned Chuck Swindoll, Priscilla Shirer. I'll find everybody that I can find. I'm sure I've overlooked some, but everybody that I can find, and I'll buy 8 or 10 books, and I'll sit there and read what each person said about this particular event in the life of Elijah. And also, I've already jotted down some of the thoughts I have about that event in the life of Elijah. And soon a message begins to emerge. And I write it out in longhand, give it to Karen, and she types it up.
Okay. All right. So um, the series theme, and then I want you to come down even a little bit more into a granular level. So now I know you're months before you're preaching it, but what does it look like to build an outline for you for that message, individual message, not the series, but the message itself?
Yeah, I appreciated what you said about Andy Stanley, because he's great about an opening. He truly is, and I
And I
think
don't.
that's
We didn't say that on recording, but we talked to him about just the ability of his introductions are just stunning.
okay. Okay. Well, they are. His introductions are great. Well, let me just back up.
Yeah.
I was kind of going down a part of your question
Okay.
that you really didn't ask. For me, the outline consists of just what they taught us back in communications at Abilene Christian College back in 1971. Say what you're going to say it, and say what you said. I've never quite gotten away from that.
Yeah.
So I'll say it. I want to give it summarize the whole message in one sentence. That's a great tip I was given many years ago. Declare what you're going to say. The story. If you struggled with depression, you have a friend in Elijah.
Mm-hmm.
Does that surprise you? We never thought Elijah, who stared down the 450 prophets on Mount Carmel. So then I'm digging in, but you know what depression is like. Then I might tell the story of my mother, who battled depression her whole life. My dad called it the blues. He told my brother and me, when she's like that, just leave her alone. And I might retell that story. And you can relate maybe to Naomi Judd, who died by suicide just a few months ago. Why? And I found a great quote, or a powerful quote from her life. And then here's how Elijah found himself in a cave of depression. And so I'm into the message. I'll tell about Jezebel and Ahab. Got to set the context again. But then let's follow him as he goes down all the way to Sinai and retell the story of the still small whisper. But then I want to conclude with answering the question, what do I want the audience to know? What do I want the audience to feel? What do I want the audience to do? Again, that's kind of homiletics 101, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
What do I want you to know? I want you to know this. I want you to be able to retell what happened to Elijah that led him into depression. What I want you to feel, I want you to feel God's compassion. Look how God came after Elijah. Look how God pursued him. You're not alone. You think you're alone. You're stuck in a cave, but you're not alone. But what do I want you to do? Well, God told Elijah, go back, appoint Elisha. I have 7,000 more who have not bowed their knees to Baal. What do I want? What does God want you and me to do? Well, I think he wants us to get out of the cave, to head back, to trust him, to receive him, get back into fellowship, those kind of things. So that's a strong introduction.
Mm-hmm.
Then unpack the story. What do I want people to know, feel, and do? And that's kind of it.
Okay. So tell me about how you bring in, and how do you, I mean, even here, even in this interview, you started telling the story, and I was tracking with Max. And so how does Max Lucado uh, prepare to tell a story? There's certain unique things that are just not duplicable about Max Lucado, but we all can be better storytellers. What do you do to make that storytelling effective?
Boy, that is a good question. And I wish I knew the answer to it.
Is it just natural for you?
Yeah, I've always loved stories, Ed.
Okay.
I always have. I have a memory of running for some student council office when I was 14 years old. I guess it would be middle school or high school. And getting up and telling a story as my campaign speech and watching how all the other kids perked up.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a story that we've all used about this father who had 6 sons, and he gave each one of them a log and told them to set that log on fire, and they couldn't get the log on fire. And he said, now bring it all together, put them together. Let's all work together and set it on fire. And all of a sudden, all the logs were ablaze. If we all come together, we can set things on fire. I mean, that the kind of story, that you can find online so quick. But I do recall, Ed, saying, wow, people really listen to that story. And then I've loved stories. I can be accused even of early on having too many stories in my sermons, instead of teaching a passage. Boy, I'm struggling to find a good answer. I think I do have a natural bent towards stories. I read them, I collect them.
It's a gift to it. But so how do you, I mean, give us some, because I agree with you. It just flows from you. I mean, we've spent time together and everything is a story with Max Lucado. But help me to think about, or think with me about, how then do you decide which stories to use? How then do you find the stories? Those kinds of things.
Okay. I think the caveat is I have been guilty of a story being so good that it was going to go in that sermon no matter what point I was trying to make.
Searching for a text now that you got a story.
Yeah, that's right. This story is so good. My 6-year-old granddaughter came running in the other day, and she said, 911, 911. And she was so cute. And she said, Max, her 4-year-old brother, my grandson, she said, Max is stuck and he can't get up. We live on 3 acres. And I thought, oh no, he fell in a ravine or something. So we ran outside, and as we're running, I said, Rosie, what happened? She said, well, he filled his pockets with rocks and his pants fell to his ankles. Well, I started chuckling, and sure enough, we get there, and the only thing separating Max from the pavement was his Spider-Man underwear, and he was squatted on the ground. He was crying, and I said, Max, stand up. And when he stood up, the pants stayed down, and sure enough, he'd placed rocks in all 4 pockets, and so I said, you want me to help you? And he said, yes. And so I went over and unloaded his pockets. And Ed, for the life of me, I was going to tell that story the following Sunday. I don't care what I was teaching on. I was going to tell that story. It was too good. And I didn't want to risk dying and going to heaven and not telling that story. No, I think I'm always on the hunt for a story like that. I mean, that one illustrates so many different things, right?
Right, totally.
I came out of that story and I said, what's keeping you from moving forward? What weight is holding you down? So here are 2 or 3 big ideas, I think, on stories.
Yeah.
Great stories are personal stories. There's no comparison. Great stories are personal stories. Personal stories can never be self-promoting.
Mhm.
They just can't. I think I see this in a lot of pastors, and I just want to take them to the side and say, hey, don't drop names. You don't try to sound impressive. The fact of the matter is, Ed, we're in such a unique position already. People call us reverend, or they call us pastor or vicar, and we already have a title that elevates us. And then we're either in a pulpit or next to a stand, we're on a stage, we're on a platform. So everything about us says we're high and you're low. We don't mean that to be the case, but it just is. We need to do everything we can to counterbalance that. So it's essential that we poke fun at ourselves.
Mhm.
And if we ever tell a story that that promotes ourselves, that
Right.
distances us from
Right.
the audience. Yeah. So I
Yeah,
think those two personal stories, stories that make fun of yourself,
yeah.
have fun with yourself. Don't take yourself so seriously. You don't have to impress anybody. And then also be honest about your own pain. Be
Yeah.
honest about your own pain. Don't load every sermon with all your problems.
Right.
But if you can acknowledge that you have a mother who battled depression, which
Right.
I will say, though I myself, I don't think I need to fabricate some story that I've battled depression. I've had mood swings, but I've not like the people in the church have. I don't want to, but I think I can talk about I'm acquainted with depression because my mother was. See, that's an example, I think, of an illustration that
Mhm.
that is really helpful. Is this
Makes
helpful,
sense.
Ed?
Oh, very much helpful. How many illustrations per sermon
Mm,
typically, and how do you decide?
yeah. I don't have a formula.
Okay.
I don't. Uh, I would say three or four,
Okay.
3 or 4. Um, I would say most of the time I open with a story because a story grabs people's attention. I would say, I think this is a little surprising, but I would say most of the time I will inject a funny story midway through the message because people have been sitting there for 15 or 20 minutes. They need something to get them to take a good deep breath to wake them up. And nothing does that better than laughter. So I've been prone to put a joke 2/3 of the way or midway through, or tell some funny story on myself midway through, and then I conclude with a story. I love a strong story at the very end.
Mhm.
But I'm forever on the hunt with them.
Yeah. Where do
Uh,
you hunt?
yeah, there's no place I don't hunt. There's
Okay.
really not.
Do you
There is
like I
there.
remember back in the day, there was this book of 8,000
I've got it.
illustrations.
I've
What is
got
that?
it.
Ton or something? I forget the name.
Yeah, I know it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now I don't use that in
Yeah,
books.
the
I don't
internet sort of replaced a lot of those things.
internet.
Yeah.
And in the necessity of footnoting everything,
Yeah,
it
totally.
is has made and we need to footnote everything. We need
Yeah,
to
don't tell someone else's stories as if they're your own or your life or things of that sort. That's yeah.
right,
We all agree
right,
with that. But you just need, I mean, if you're doing a story, I've never seen you start a message without a story. So,
right.
and I'm sure you have, but I've never seen you. So you start with a story, humorous story in the middle, key story at the end. That's 3 stories a message. That's or illustrations. We could call them illustrations or stories because
Yeah,
they're not always stories. So that's, what is it? If we have 12, 13, 14 a month,
yeah,
that's
yeah.
that's a 100 a year,
It's a
and
lot.
to be honest, I mean, with Max Lucado's story building ability, people are gonna remember if you reuse the story. That's a lot of illustrations.
It's a lot to come up with,
Yeah.
and it's one of the most challenging parts, I think, of my teaching style. Now
Yeah.
there are people who are what would the word be, Ed? More didactic, more
Yeah, sure.
um, just tell the stick to the text, never deviate, tell what it says, history of the scripture, and so forth. And I try to do that more. Uh, I think we all land on our style, what works
Mhm.
best for us. But yeah, I consequently, because I so depend on stories, both for preaching and writing, I'm always on the hunt.
Yeah,
There's
so
no
talk to
place
us
I don't look.
about how you work and engage the biblical text in that context, and, because I've seen you kind of do it you weave the narratives together. I've seen you do well, several different approaches. So when you're working through Elijah, right, and
Mhm.
you're bringing these texts into your weekly messages. I focus on the story, but I know I've heard you preach. We're working through texts. What does that look like? How do you prepare the biblical text and bring it forth in your message?
Trying to think of after all these years, it flows naturally. I don't
Okay.
really have a particular formula that I follow. But let me say this. What if I am able to reduce this weekend's message down to a single promise?
Hmm.
That's what I do. I'm sitting here thinking, what do I do? Sometimes we don't know what we do until someone asks us, but that's what I do. I think, what is my takeaway? What's the one thing I want people to know? And what I want them to know is that you're not alone in your depression.
Hmm.
Some of the greatest prophet in history battled depression. But here's what you can do. You can come out of the cave. And so once I've got those 3 or 4 big ideas, Ed, kind of like the big rocks,
Right.
in the jar,
Right.
then I go back and I think, oh, wait a second. What was that story? What was that great quote from Charles Spurgeon, where he said something about the bow cannot always be taught? And so I go dig back and oh yeah, I know where that was. And I've got a folder called depression, and I actually found that quote. And in the process, I found another one from Martin Luther about, he said, if you're feeling depressed, go and hang out with your pigs rather than stay alone in your house. It's a great
Wow.
quote,
Wow.
but his point was get out
Yeah.
of the cave. And
Yeah.
so that's what I'm doing, Ed. I've got my promise. I've got my 2 or 3 points. Now I want to go back and adorn or decorate this sermon with illustrations or stories, whether out of my own life or ones that I can use from history.
Okay. So, a lot of the challenge that for a lot of preachers is they love the Bible. They love to see God work among His people, but preachers and teachers sometimes struggle with um, the preaching being compelling. We've all seen sermons from people who love Jesus and who love the Word of God, and yet you went away saying, I don't really know that that moved anything."
Yeah,
And again, we can say with the Holy Spirit's job, and
yeah.
and, and I do think that it is in part the Holy Spirit's job. But how would you encourage maybe young or new preachers to build messages that are compelling, that draw people in? I mean, that's such a phrase I could use for you. You just draw people in. When I preached at your church, I was so nervous because you're like the master storyteller. I put in more stories, and even as I did more stories, I just watched your room just respond to you. So, how would you give advice for those young or new preachers to draw people in to find the message compelling so they want to apply it and live the word of God in their lives?
2 or 3 thoughts come to mind, Ed. Number one, I I've heard it attributed to Charles Spurgeon, but I don't know for sure if he's the one who said it or just made it famous. But preach like there's a broken heart on every pew has been a real mantra for me, because there truly is a broken heart on every pew, even though most churches don't have pews anymore. But and then secondly, the mistake I see made more than any is in an effort to make too many points, we make no point. In an effort to say so much, we say so little. Uh, there is a story about a pastor's son, the son of a pastor, and the father requested that the son summarize in a telegram. This is back in the 100 years ago, but summarize in a telegram the sermon on Saturday night and send it to the father. And that was his way of teaching the son to there's nothing wrong with a long sermon, but
Right.
there is something wrong with a sermon that's trying to say too many points. What's
Hmm.
your main point? What's your main point? I have a great editor for my books, and she requires that I do this. She'll ask me to summarize the whole book in a sentence. And that's a challenge when you're studying, the life of Joseph. What's the summary of the life of Joseph in a sentence? But that's a good exercise. And so I think preach like there's a broken heart on every pew. See if you can summarize your whole sermon in one sentence. And it's better to make 1 point well than 10 points poorly. So
Mm.
try to go a little deeper in that 1 point. Good communication is really saying the same thing, but from a variety of different ways.
Hmm.
Doing so with stories, doing so with poems. I still read poetry. I love to share poems or verses or telling history lessons. So it's saying the same thing, but just come at it because people hear things in a different way. Um,
Yeah, and you some of the communicators talking to are very point driven. Point one,
mhm,
and point two, and you actually know there's like a pause and a pivot at that point. Um, you seem to have more turning points in your messages rather than those distinctly outlining things. How do you think about working through a 30 to 40-minute message so that there are waypoints along the way?
mm,
How would you describe it?
mhm, yeah. Yeah, there's an emotional ebb and flow to the sermon. I think you begin a sermon by wanting to become friends with your audience, uh, acknowledging there's a broken heart on every pew, acknowledging some people are in church and they don't want to be, acknowledging people are passing through tough times. What can I say to just put us all at ease, uh, and say, let's be friends. Let's just spend a few moments talking through this topic. And then I think it works, at least for me, Ed, to speak to the head for a few minutes
Hmm.
and then speak to the heart
Hmm.
for a few minutes. Again, as long as we're talking about Elijah, let me tell the story about, here's our context. Remember, our hero has just come down off Mount Carmel, and he goes straight to Jezreel, and Ahab has to go report to Cruella de Vil, and she's going to get upset. So I'm giving I'm not trying to do anything except communicate, impart information there. And then there's a pivot, and I say, don't we expect Elijah here to go back against Jezebel like he's already done when Jezebel announces that she's going to destroy him? But he doesn't. He doesn't. Now, I would see right there, Ed, is a great opportunity to go from the head to the heart with a question, something like, are you ever surprised by your own reaction to stress? Are you ever disappointed in yourself? Or does the fog ever come over your life unexpectedly? Boy, it did to. And those kind of questions, Ed, are are really important. They're the connective tissue between getting from head to heart
Hmm.
and then back up to head. These questions are so helpful to connect a message together.
Hmm. And of course, we're focusing a lot on your use of story and illustration. And I want to ask this in a negative way. A lot of times when I'm listening to pastors or just people, and they just tell stories, and the stories are, I just get trapped in their long story.
Yeah.
We've all felt this way. We're like,
Uh-huh.
okay, what you got to get to the point. Um, I don't find that. I still stay, I'm just engaged as you tell the story. But my guess is that you must have a way to make sure that your stories aren't too long and aren't too where people are like, okay, what's the point of this story? Because we've all felt this way. Preachers can
Yeah.
tell stories forever. And I just walk down the hallway here at Wheaton College, and I see professors. The students are in classes and they're telling there, and sometimes the professor will just get on me. They'll just get off on a rabbit trail. You're not doing that. How do you make sure you don't do that? Because I'm guessing along the way you've said one or two times, you know what? I just went off on a rabbit trail there, and that story didn't work. How do I tighten this? What do you think?
Early in my preaching, somebody gave me a copy of the book, and this is going to date probably you as well, because you will remember very well Paul Harvey and the
Yeah,
rest of the story. Remember when he used to
I
do?
was literally gonna say, now you know the rest of the story. Talking to you at some point. That's true.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I've got two little paperback books. The guy was brilliant.
He
The
was.
rest of the story, little paperback books that his son created based on that series. And I can recall getting so excited about sharing those stories, Ed, that I would tell the story and then I would look up and 15 minutes had passed. And I had spent 15 minutes telling a story. And that's not what people come to. The story
Right.
must serve the promise or the message of the
Okay.
text. The
Okay.
story has to. For me, again, this is all personal. But if a story is longer than 1 page of my manuscript, it's too long. It's too long.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Now, here's a great tool, and that is tell a long story, but it is the story of the sermon. Come back and refer to it. Last weekend, I preached a sermon again about Elijah, about how Elijah prayed for the rain to come after Mount Carmel, uh, because he knew God had said there will be rain. And so I talked about praying the promises of God. He went back up on the mountain, he prayed and he prayed and he prayed 7 times, always sending that servant to look to see if rain was coming. But I started that sermon by telling about a cooking class that my wife and I went to when we were at a resort for our 40th wedding anniversary. I did not want to go to that cooking class. I had never taken any cooking in my life. I don't want to learn to cook, but I did everything that chef told me to do because I acknowledged he was the authority and I wasn't. And it was a fun story to tell. I kind of worked it out. And I referred back to that story 3 times during that sermon, because I'd already told it. I didn't have to reacquaint them with the name of the chef, where we were. I'd already invested, 6 or 7 minutes telling the story. So I could go back and say, just like I did that day with the chef, remember, I trusted him. What if we do the same with our prayers? God has promised that if we come to him and ask him, he'll respond. I did that with the chef. I'm going to do that with God. Those kind of statements. So in that case, Ed, I would have to go back and look at the sermon, but I think that was the only story. But I just used it several times.
The narrative was woven
Wove it through.
throughout your
Perfect.
message.
Perfect.
And I've seen you do it where you weave the text together, you keep coming back to, you weave in the story, and then and this is where I was going to talk about Paul Harvey. Those who don't know, was this commentator, and he'd tell a story, and it was always something you didn't know, and he'd end with, now you know the rest of the story. And
Classic.
you seem to often, maybe not often, but I've heard you do on more than one occasion, you start telling the story. The story's interesting. It ties into the text, it ties into the message. But then you do have a sense of big reveal at the end, like Paul Harvey. Now you know the rest of the story. And people are going, and then you bring in your main point to draw people to some response to the Lord or some action. So what does that look like in your notes? Like, is it like, come back to this, come back to this? I mean, give us the mechanics of that kind of storytelling.
In my notes, it will be word for word. I
Right.
really write it out, Ed, and looking for the zinger, for
Right.
the phrase.
The zinger. Okay.
Uh, an example. I guess the best way for me to communicate this is to just keep using examples. But I was on a flight one time, and there was a fly buzzing around inside the plane, and it was driving we passengers crazy. And somebody turned to me and said, "Why does the fly fly on a flight?" It was just the greatest little line. So I started the sermon, and the sermon was about grace, Ed. So why is that fly flying on a flight? And I kept coming back to that. And that was a treasure. I mean, that little sentence there sticks with people so well. And I tied it in to the teaching of the Apostle Paul about grace. Why do we strive? Why do we work? The plane is going to support us. The plane supported the fly. The fly made no progress. He did not journey anywhere he wouldn't have anyway, but he was just buzzing around using all that energy. I don't know, maybe he was, thinking that he had to stay busy. And you can really milk a little story like that. But to me, finding that phrase, why does a fly fly on a flight, is pure gold. And so at the end of the sermon, I say, remember the fly. He was flying on the flight and he didn't have to. what about you? What about you and me? Why don't we sit down? Why don't we rest? And boom, you got it. But it'll take me quite a bit of time to find the right question, the right phrase, the right way to wrap that up. But yeah, I go in up on the pulpit with my manuscript because I don't want to risk messing up that transition.
Fascinating. Fascinating. Clearly, the level of intentionality. These are not off the cuff stories from Max Lucado, and I think how they're crafted and more. So thanks for taking the time to. I mean, I think a lot of folks are going to be helped. And again, I would encourage listeners not to jump in and try to turn into a Max Lucado level storyteller, but areas we can grow. I'd listen more to his preaching as well, and grow in that. I mean, you're just uniquely gifted, Max. But I think we can all learn and do better. And thanks for taking the time to talk
Well,
with us.
you're
Great,
kind.
great experience.
I don't know if I've helped at all. I feel
Oh,
like I
I
did
think
a
a lot.
lot of rambling, but if I did, I'm thankful. Thanks. I
Thanks.
love this topic. I really appreciate it.
Appreciate you.